Steel versus aluminum. Some divers always go diving with an aluminum tank. Others swear that steel is the best thing that you can use. In this video, we're going to dive into the pros and cons of each kind of tank and which one is best for you. In this video, we're going to talk about the aluminum 80 or the 11-liter tank and why that's the most common tank that divers end up using. We're going to talk about the physical characteristics that you need to look at in any tank that you end up getting. Then we're going to go into the pros and cons of both steel, aluminum tanks, and finally going to wrap everything up to figure out which tank is right for you. The first tank that I want to talk about is this tank right here. This is an aluminum 80 or an 11-liter tank. And this is the tank that a lot of people first got certified on. There's a good chance that when you took your scuba diver course, this is probably the tank that you were using. So what ends up happening a lot of times is when people decide that they want to buy their own gear and they start looking for scuba cylinders, simply because this was the tank that they trained with, this ends up becoming the tank that they bought. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a good tank for many applications, but depending on what you're going to use the tank for, it may or may not be right for you. Before we talk about the differences between steel tanks and aluminum tanks, you need to understand that there's certain characteristics that all tanks have, and these characteristics are what's going to really be the determining factor as to which tank is right for you. Now, the first characteristic you need to be aware of is capacity. Capacity is the amount of usable gas that you have inside the tank, and different tanks have different capacities. The capacities are going to be either in cubic feet or liters, depending on what part of the world you're in. Now, a larger person might need a larger capacity tank, and a smaller person might need a smaller capacity tank, simply because their breathing rate is going to be different. Now, also, the capacity is always going to be rated at a working pressure or a service pressure, and something that you need to be aware of when you're looking at different tanks is what their working pressure is. Because if you're using, for example, a higher pressure tank, and you're going to a dive shop or dive store, and that dive shop doesn't have a compressor that can fill that tank to a higher pressure, then you might end up getting a tank that can't be filled to its full working pressure, and thus you're not going to have all the volume of gas that you were hoping to get. Also, if you have a higher pressure tank, in some cases, the regulator that you're using may not be able to work with that higher pressure. So it's one of the things that you need to be aware of is the working pressure as well as the capacity. Another thing that you need to take into consideration when you're choosing your tank is its physical size. I have 3 different tanks here just for illustration. This is an aluminum 63, an aluminum 80, and a high pressure 133. As you can see, they each have a completely different size. And this might be a consideration for you because if you have a smaller size, for example, and you're a shorter person, this is going to sit better on your back than if you end up trying to dive with a bigger tank like this one. Or if you're a larger person, this might be too small for you. So it really depends on the size. It might depend on you and your physical characteristics when you go diving. Also, these tanks have different weights. So this aluminum 63 is lighter than this high pressure 133. And the weight itself might be a consideration because you may not want to carry so much weight when you're getting onto and off of the dive boat or if you're diving off of the beach. Something else to be aware of is that all tanks have certain buoyancy characteristics. And what I mean by this is when a tank is full, most tanks are going to be negative in the water when you first get in the water. Now, some tanks are more negative than others, and that's something you want to be aware of because if a tank is too negative and your BCD, for example, doesn't have enough lift, that can get you into trouble. But aside from that, remember, the air that's inside the tank or the gas that's inside the tank, you're going to consume it as you're diving. And the buoyancy characteristics of the tank are going to change throughout the dive. So a tank that might start out negative, in some instances, might end up being positive at the end of the dive, and different tanks at the end of the dive might still end up being negative. And also remember, like all these tanks, you're never going to drain them down to 0, but the buoyancy characteristics are going to change. Something else that you need to be aware of is the useful life of the scuba tank that you're thinking about getting. Now, remember, in your scuba class, you probably learned that all tanks need to be visually inspected every year and hydrostatically inspected every 5 years. In general, steel cylinders tend to last a really long time. I don't want to say forever, but it's not uncommon to have 30 and 40-year-old steel tanks still in service. With aluminum tanks, it's a little bit different. And the reason why is because many years ago, there was a certain alloy of aluminum that failed hydrostatic testing pretty much across the board. And for this reason, certain dive shops, when it comes to aluminum, this is a little bit of a controversial subject, but certain dive shops won't fill aluminum cylinders once they get to be 15 or 20 years old. And depending on where you are in the world, you want to check with your dive shop because the last thing you want to do is get a tank, think it's going to last you a long time, and in reality, once it hits a certain age, your dive shop doesn't want to fill it. Something else that you want to consider is the bottom of the tank itself. Now, when it comes to steel tanks, most steel tanks are rounded at the bottom, and this means you're going to need to use a boot in order for it to be able to stand up on its own. And when it comes to aluminum tanks, they're generally all flat. So this means you will not need a boot, but some people do choose to have boots on the bottom of the tank. Another thing, and this is really obvious, is how much is the scuba tank going to cost you? So in general, steel tanks tend to cost a little more, but they have different characteristics than aluminum tanks, but it's something that you want to be aware of and you want to look at when you're choosing your tank. And then finally, and most importantly, you want to make sure that you like this video, subscribe, and hit the little bell notification so you get notified when we put new videos out. Now that you know all the characteristics of scuba tanks, let's talk specifically about aluminum tanks and the pros and cons of them. I want to start out with the pros. And the first pro is that aluminum tanks tend to be less expensive than the same comparably sized steel tank. Also, aluminum tanks tend to be lighter. This means that if you're going to be carrying the tank on and off the boat or over to the beach, it's going to be lighter carrying an aluminum tank than it would be a comparably sized steel tank. And finally, aluminum tanks can't rust. This means that they're less maintenance in general than steel tanks. However, they can oxidize, so it's not like you could just not take care of it. You still have to rinse them off and take care of the aluminum tank, but they generally tend to be less maintenance than a comparable steel tank. When it comes to the cons of aluminum tanks, as I mentioned earlier, depending on where you are, it may have a shorter lifespan than steel tanks. Also, aluminum tanks tend to be more buoyant than steel tanks. And what this means is because at the end of the dive, an aluminum tank tends to be a little more buoyant, you may need to take more weight on your weight belt or your ditchable weights than you would with a steel tank. And then finally, aluminum tanks tend to be a little bit bigger, and this is because aluminum is a softer metal, so they need to beef it up and put thicker walls on it in order to hold pressure inside the tank. So they generally tend to be bigger than steel tanks. Now that we talked about the pros and cons of aluminum tanks, let's talk about the pros and cons of steel. And I have a steel high pressure 119 tank here for illustration. And the reason why is I want to show you something. If I bring up what everybody is used to diving with, or the most common tank, which is the aluminum 80, you can see that the aluminum 80 is actually bigger than my high pressure steel 119. However, it only contains 80 cubic feet of gas. So this tank holds 50% more gas, and it does so actually in a smaller package than this tank does. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of people end up diving steel, is simply because they can pack more gas into a smaller size than they could with an aluminum tank. Now, the other thing about steel tanks, and this is the other pro, is they tend to be less buoyant. So they're a little bit more negative. And the reason why that's a pro is because with this tank, at the end of the dive, you end up having to have weight to compensate for the positive buoyancy of this tank. And when you're diving steel, you get to take that weight off, and that is actually compressed into the cylinder itself. That's in your center of mass in your body. So it's better buoyancy characteristics, and you can get rid of some of the weight that you're carrying around in your weight belt. When it comes to cons for steel tanks, there's really only three things that you need to keep in mind. First of all, they tend to weigh a little bit more than aluminum tanks. So when you're carrying them onto and off of the boat, or if you're doing a beach dive, you're going to be carrying more weight with a steel tank. Also, steel tanks can rust, so they require a little bit more maintenance. You need to make sure that you rinse them off really well. It's just something that you need to know about steel tanks. And finally, they do tend to cost a little bit more than aluminum tanks, but in general, they tend to have a little bit longer lifespan, so it ends up paying off in the long run. So which type of tank is right for you? Is it aluminum or is it steel? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on the kind of dive you're going to be doing. It depends on your own physical characteristics. It depends on really a lot of different factors. The type of tank that I might use if I'm diving on a 40-foot reef is going to be different than what I want to use if I go diving on a 110-foot shipwreck. Now, some of the things I'm going to consider are going to be my breathing rate, the depth that I'm going to be diving to, the weight of the tank itself, the buoyancy characteristics of the tank, of course, the price, and there's many other factors. And for this reason, we have a comprehensive table on our website. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. I really encourage you to click on that link and go check out all the different tanks that are available to you, because we have a comprehensive list of all the major manufacturers and all the different tanks that are available to you there. Also, if you like this video, make sure you check out our free guide, The 4 Keys to Mastering Your Diving. In it, we go into 4 specific skills that you can master that'll take your diving to the next level on your next dive. We'll leave a link in the description below, or you can click here to my side.